Welcome to American History Lesson 30. The Vietnam War. Our lesson objectives are: identify the cause of America's involvement in the Vietnam War, identify the immediate effects of the Vietnam War on America, identify political events that impacted American morale, identify the long-term impact of the Vietnam War on both combatants. Vietnam prior to the America's Vietnam War. After World War II, Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh and other nationalist groups fought the French, who tried to re-establish colonial rule. The United States helped the French with military supplies. The nationalists won in 1954. A peace agreement temporarily split the country and called for an election and unity in 1956. South Vietnam's Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem canceled the elections and declared himself head of a new government. President Eisenhower supported Diem, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win a national election. Opponents to Diem in South Vietnam, known as Viet Cong, began guerrilla attacks. President Kennedy continued Eisenhower's policy and sent some American troops to train his army. Diem, meanwhile, acted harshly and lost support in South Vietnam. With U.S. support, military leaders in South Vietnam overthrew Diem in 1963. The United States did not want South Vietnam to fall to the Communist North. When U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin were attacked in 1964 by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, President Johnson retaliated with a bombing attack. Then in February of 1965, Johnson launched a major bombing attack on North Vietnam cities. The next month, the first U.S. combat troops arrived. The Vietnam War begins. President Johnson's decision to send American troops to Vietnam was widely popular, although some aides did warn that the policy was dangerous. The American commanders were there asked for growing numbers of troops. By 1967, almost 400,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. Johnson and his aides hoped for a quick victory, but it did not happen. These troops found the war frustrating. The Viet Cong struck quickly in small groups and then disappeared in the jungle or in an elaborate system of tunnels. American soldiers' superior weaponry was of little use. The policy of winning support among the people of South Vietnam did not work either. The course of war lowered the morale of American soldiers, as did the weakness and corruption of the South Vietnamese government. Fun fact: the tunnel system used by the North Vietnamese soldiers were vastly different from one another. While some were large enough for sleeping quarters, kitchens, and conference rooms, and even theaters, many were barely wider than a man's shoulder length and nearly impossible to move in. Sickness was rampant in the tunnel system, with malaria being the second highest cause of death. Of the 16,000 North Vietnamese soldiers who fought in the tunnels, less than 6,000 would survive the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War and the American people. Rising costs of the war forced President Johnson to cut spending on his Great Society programs. TV news film of the war contradicted the administration's glowing reports of progress. Disapproval of the president's policy spread. Many young men avoided the military draft by getting medical releases or by entering the reserves. Many, especially white middle-class young men, obtained draft deferments because they were college students. Because of the draft deferments, U.S. troops in Vietnam were mostly working-class whites and members of minority groups, prompting protests from civil rights leaders. Unrest was growing on college campuses in the early 1960s as the New Left promoted major changes in American society. In 1965, this movement began to criticize U.S. policy in Vietnam. Thousands marched on Washington to protest the war. Eventually, some draft registers were imprisoned, and many deserted to Canada. By 1967, Americans were divided into hawks who supported administration policy and doves who wanted the war to end. Many felt that doves were showing disloyalty by protesting while Americans were fighting. Early in 1968, the Viet Cong launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam, known as the Tet Offensive. After weeks of fighting, the U.S. commander said the Viet Cong had been defeated, but American confidence in the war was deeply shaken. Some presidential aides questioned the war. Johnson's popularity fell sharply, and Senator Eugene McCarthy almost defeated Johnson in a presidential primary. Johnson responded by announcing that he would not seek re-election as president and that he was willing to seek a negotiated peace in Vietnam. Soon the nation was stunned by the murders of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert Kennedy, who was campaigning for the Democratic nomination for president. Meanwhile, protests rocked college campuses. The political turmoil plunged the Democratic Convention in Chicago into chaos. While the convention nominated Hubert Humphrey for president, bitter anti-war protesters staged rallies and protests that were met by police attacks. The violent attack showed deep division in the country. A new president, a new direction. The Republicans nominated former Vice President Richard Nixon. Campaigning for law and order and promising that he had a plan to end the war, Nixon won the election. An independent candidate, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, won significant support. On reaching the White House, Nixon began to withdraw American troops from Vietnam as part of his strategy of giving the major role in the war to South Vietnam. He ordered massive bombings of the North to persuade leaders there to agree to a peace, leaving South Vietnam intact. When Nixon announced that he had sent U.S. troops to attack Viet Cong supplies in Cambodia, protests erupted on college campuses. At Kent State, nervous National Guard troops killed 4 students. Support for the war eroded in Congress, then was further reduced when newspapers published documents showing that the Johnson administration had lied about the war. The Vietnam War ends and its far-reaching impact. A new North Vietnamese offensive in March 1972 brought increased bombing. As the 1972 election neared, Nixon announced progress in the peace talks, but a problem arose as Nixon ordered more bombing of the North. In January 1973, all parties agreed to a peace. U.S. troops came home, but North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain in South Vietnam. In March 1975, they defeated the government of South Vietnam. Vietnamese deaths topped 1.5 million. The victorious communists punished many in South Vietnam, and over 1 million people fled the country. Communist rebels took Cambodia and killed about 2 million people. The United States suffered 58,000 dead and 365,000 wounded. Surviving American soldiers found it difficult to come home as they were met with hostility or neglect. The divisions over the war lingered, with former hawks and doves angry at each other. Congress passed a law preventing the president from committing troops in a foreign conflict without its approval. The war changed American foreign policy and caused a feeling of mistrust toward the government that remains. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.